Please help me in welcoming Maude Barlow.
Thank you very, very much for such a gorgeous welcome, and thank you for so many of you coming out, and thank you, Regina Water Watch, for the tremendous work you do. And I wanted to take just a few minutes to talk about this, what we're doing here, because it's very important, but it's also very important against a backdrop of what's happening in the world. I say without exaggeration that this is the crisis of our time. It is part of climate change. But we tend to see water as a victim of climate change, but more and more I believe that the way we displace and abuse and mismanage water, it is a cause of climate crisis, and we are missing that piece of this puzzle. We are pulling up the Ogallala Aquifer, which is that aquifer that goes down the spine of the United States and produces the majority of their food, plus $20 billion worth of exports. The Department of Agriculture in the U.S. said last year it will be gone in our lifetime. There's not an if, it's just a case of how long it's going to take. Last of the studies, to tell you one which was done through the World Bank by actually the big food and bottled water companies, said that by 2030, the demand for water in our world will outstrip supply by 40%. And Canada is not exempt. We are more lucky than many places in the world. We have a very old law from 1970 that's totally inadequate, no national drinking water standards, appalling conditions in many First Nations communities around water. And if that isn't bad enough, the Harper government has just gutted all of the freshwater legislation that we had. It wasn't adequately enforced, but certainly was there, from the Fisheries Act to the Navigable Waters Protection Act to the environmental assessment process. All of it is gone. 99% of our rivers and lakes are no longer protected for any pipeline carrying any horrible substance going on under or around them. So we are not exempt in this country, and when we look at what we're doing here in Regina and throughout different parts of the country, we have to put this against this backdrop. There is then, you would not be surprised to know, with this dwindling water stock and this demand going straight up and the supply going down, a mighty contest between those who would put water as a market commodity on the open market to be bought and sold, and those of us who believe that water is a public trust that belongs to the people, the ecosystem, future generations, and is a fundamental human right. What we're dealing with here, of course, is one of them, with the creation of private for-profit water utilities. Alberta, right next door to us, is now seriously talking about water trading, where they convert the licenses to a water right and you trade, and of course the big companies come in, or the big agribusiness come in and swallow up the small, and then what happened in Australia, then the investors came in, and then the foreign investors came in, and suddenly the price of water went through the roof. And when the government tried to buy water back to try to rescue the Murray-Darling, which was dying, they couldn't afford the water because it had been privatized. Now, it is my deep belief that we need a new water ethic in our world, and I think we would look at things like trade and energy policy and agriculture policy, economic policy fundamentally differently if we had to ask what is the impact on water. For instance, Canada is negotiating this comprehensive agreement with Europe. The two biggest water companies in the world are Suez and Veolia from France, so from Europe, chomping at the bit for this. If any of the cities in Canada do go ahead and privatize their water services under this directive from the Harper government, and then this agreement is signed, these companies are going to, and these companies are involved. If a future government in this city, for instance, were to change its mind, they wouldn't be able to. They would have to pay, or the federal government would have to pay millions and potentially billions of dollars of compensation to these companies because the investment conditions had changed. So what we're seeing is a kind of an enclosure of the laws that we have to protect our water, even though, as Pierre correctly says, they're not making headway on the privatization. They're coming at it in a whole bunch of different ways. So it is my belief that we have to fiercely manage and protect our water supplies around the world. And I want to say this as strongly as I can. We cannot do this if we give away public oversight and democratic control of our local water supplies. You cannot have it both ways. You cannot say we're going to protect this water and hand it over to those who want to privatize and profit from it, particularly when these agreements are secret, not public, not for public consumption. So it's against this backdrop that we need to look at the debate here in Regina, and I believe that the referendum coming up here is not only going to make history in this province, but across the country. The water in your watershed is a public trust, and it is a public service, and it is very important for us not only to have this debate, but to have a deep discussion. I want kids talking about it in schools. I'd like to see people talking in taxi cabs to the taxi drivers. I'd like to see us talking over our back, our neighbors over the back fence about what does it mean? What do we mean when we say public or private? Essentially, the difference is the profit motive. In a public service, you take the taxes, you take the fees that you're charging people for water, you put that money together and you deliver a service. And obviously we need to deliver a better service on waste treatment. But we deliver a service and every penny goes back into that service. When you have a for-profit company, even if it's efficient, and many of them aren't, and even if it's honest, and let me tell you many of them aren't, even if they are honest and efficient, they have to find at least 15 to 20% of the same using the same funds to get to their investors, and that means that they have to cut corners, which they do all the time. They have to lay off employees, which they do all the time, and they raise the rate of water, and this is absolutely what's happened all over the world. All over the world, as Pierre said, municipalities are regretting the decision they made to move ahead with privatization. In the first decade of Great Britain's experiment with privatization, the water rates went up 150%. Thames Water, for a short time, owned the Hamilton system. The CEO of Thames Water last year earned a salary of $675,000, got a bonus the same year of $640,000, and is in line for a performance pay of $1.5 million over the next year. The company paid not 1 cent of tax last year and actually got a rebate. In Regina, City Council talks about cost, but you have to look, and I know they go back and forth about this money from the federal government. It's peanuts in terms of what it's going to cost over the lifespan of the 30 years that this will be in effect. I'll give you one example. Agbar, which is building the private water system in Barcelona, Spain, it's been estimated they're going to make over $2 billion profit in the lifespan of their contract. Now, this is money that is sucked up out of a community that is going to global investors and to pay those kind of salaries to the CEOs that should be going to infrastructure, to make sure that the poor have water, because let me tell you, water cutoffs are not just happening in poor countries in the South. Something like 90,000 people have been cut off in Detroit, Michigan, because they can't afford the rising water rates. Now, I have to say to you tonight that I think it is absolutely shocking that not only is the Harper government gutting the freshwater protections in our country, but then he's turning around and he's saying to municipalities, if you want funding for infrastructure that you need, and we're supposed to be a partner, you have no choice. You have to privatize. You have to move to this. I think that's what bullies do. I think it's blackmail. And there's a warning to City Council here and your mayor, because it's equally shocking that the mayor has taken hundreds of thousands of dollars of your taxpayers' money to turn around and force feed you in one direction. They should be promoting a debate. This is a wonderful opportunity to have a debate. Think of all the schools that could get involved in this. Think about the lesson in democracy, the lesson in how a democracy works that could take place when this happens. On the 25th of September, let's ask ourselves this question: do we really want to turn Regina's water services over to the same interests that brought us the financial crisis? because they are the same people. It is the same 1%. It is the same corporations. So standing up to those financial interests, standing up to those corporate interests, when you go into that booth on the 25th of September is an incredible statement that we need to make, and it would resonate around this country. But it's not in the end about the price of water. It is about the ethics of water and this common heritage. So I would offer to you these 4 thoughts, these 4 principles. First, that water is a fundamental human right, and that no one has the right to appropriate it for personal gain and profit while others are dying from lack of it because they cannot pay for it. Second principle is that water is a public trust, and by this we mean that water is a flow source. It's needed for life, and no one has the right to destroy it when it needs to be governed collectively by all the people, for all time. The third principle is that water has rights too, and this means that basically we move beyond thinking of water just as serving us, even in a really good way, in a collective and just and fair way, but say that water and watersheds have rights too. And finally, my 4th principle is that water can teach us how to live together. And I see a world where we're either going to have conflict and potentially war, and I name a number of places where this is happening around the world, around these declining water sources, or where we're going to come together. And that cannot happen if we turn our precious water trust, this public trust, this gift that belongs to our children and their children and their children and 7 generations on. We cannot live peacefully with one another if we have allowed the profit sector, the profit motive and greed to intrude on our water services. Water is a human right, it's a public trust, it belongs to the next generations. It will take a lot of work to do what has to be done now, but then what else have we got to do? Thank you so much.